Funding for Current Conversations is provided by the University of Oklahoma President's Office, OU Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Indiano. Today, we are on location at the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in Fort Worth, Texas. We'll be talking about racism and white privilege with our special guest, Tim Wise, a well-known author and nationally prominent speaker on issues relating to racism and racial equality. Stay with us and meet this very special guest. Tim Wise, welcome to Current Conversations.
Thank you.
Would you explain to our audience what you do for a living?
I mean, it's a hard thing. It doesn't really fit on a business card, which is why I don't have any. I suppose anti-racism educator is probably the title. I don't really think of myself as an activist as I might have 20, 25, 30 years ago, because that really is more of a grassroots, community-based kind of appellation, I think. For me, as an educator who speaks around the country, writes, does workshops and seminars, I think of myself more in that mode, like a teacher without a normal classroom.
You're not off the grid, but you're out of the norm sort of job kind of calling, and you're making your life up as you go along, and it takes a lot of energy to do that.
What I found, is also that for those of us who do that, and there are, lots of folks who do that kind of work around issues of race in this country. I'm certainly not alone in that. And I think those of us who do it would mostly agree that it is, it's the way that we have to do the work. It's not that we have a problem answering to people or having a normal job.
You can't do it on email or a day a month or something like that.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's not a hobby. It's not a side thing. It's really, we need to be out there meeting with people. And for me, that's why I've stuck with it for so long, because even though it's very tiring and even though it doesn't have the same effect on the body at 48 that it did at 26, being in community, meeting people, finding out what they're doing in their communities around issues of race and trying to share ideas with them is sort of what gives me energy and keeps me in the work and really keeps me from getting burned out. Because I think if you don't have something that you really love about this work, it can be crushing. I mean, there are a lot of issues in the country that we're dealing with that are obviously very daunting. And so you have to have that kind of release, I think.
And it's hard to see the progress sometimes.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would put you as a worker for social justice in connection with race. It's kind of a general umbrella. Do you have a working definition for social justice that kind of drives you, the one that just your way of looking at it?
I don't know that I have a working definition per se. I have a conception in my head of what I think of. To me, social justice means the creation of a society where delineations of race and gender and sexuality and class do not come with a clear division of opportunity and power. Obviously, those divisions will exist, those terms will exist, those concepts will exist, but they should not correlate with who has more and who has less. There should be no necessary relationship between color of skin, between gender and what kinds of chromosomes you have, or what your religion is, for instance, or your sexuality, and the power, access, opportunity, resources that you possess.
So you're not talking about distribution of wealth, particularly. You're talking about social access.
Well, I think part of it. I think wealth is part of it, but wealth is one piece. There is access. There's also, to me, it's about the ability to exercise self-determination and autonomy. And I think the problem that we have in this country right now is that people who are working class and lower income, people who are of color, folks who are LGBTQ, women as women, are oftentimes not only have less wealth, but they also have less ability to exercise self-determination. Communities are not able, for instance, to decide who's going to teach their children in schools, where if you don't understand working class community and community of color, you're not going to know how to relate to kids. They don't have the choice of who's going to police their streets. And so if you're in a lower income black community and all the cops are white and live in the suburbs and they have no connection to you and you don't have any way to control that, you don't get to choose who are the cops.
Or I was thinking,
that's a problem.
Or control the quality of water in your community.
Like Flint, right? Yeah. I mean, you don't have the ability to determine where your water is going to come from, if you're going to have food deserts or access to healthy nutrition. So to me, wealth is a piece of it, because wealth will, or access to money, will help you do those things better. But it's also about who controls the decisions. And I think we have to really think about ways to put more power in the hands of local communities and individuals, rather than simply thinking of it as a money thing. It's also about who decides, who teaches, who decides, who polices, that kind of thing.
To be somebody who has given his life to thinking about these issues and articulating them for other people and really being kind of a leader, I think it's what people used to call a calling, in a religious context. Was there a moment in your education or growing up, a clarifying, crystallizing experience or a role model, somebody who, or some situation that conveyed to you, yes, things could be changed. Yes, I could make a difference. Yes, this could be me who does this work.
I don't know that there were moments that told me that I could necessarily make a difference, but I certainly know that there were a number of moments along the way that raised my awareness of the problem. I went to preschool at a historically black college, so most of my early childhood friends in, pre-kindergarten were black kids. Most of the teachers, the authority figures were black women, so that when I got into elementary school in Nashville, Tennessee, I was able to maybe see some things in terms of the way people were being treated that a lot of white kids maybe would not. If I've got all these black friends and I'm used to black authority and all of a sudden I see authority being exercised against black people, whether it was tracking in education or whether it was discipline disparities in school, I'm gonna notice it because those are my friends. You're separating me from my friends. You're punishing them. So I didn't have a language for it. It's not like I was 5 years old going home first grade to my mom and saying, oh my God, you won't believe the institutional racism that takes place at my elementary school. I didn't have that language, but I knew that something was happening, and you just sort of file those things away. And over the course of my life, I think I just filed a lot of those kinds of experiences away. Finally, when I got out of college, it happened to be at a particular moment in the history of both our country and the state of Louisiana where I was living, when David Duke was running for the U.S. Senate and then governor. So I got involved in that campaign.
Clarified issues a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's, when you have a Nazi running for
Right.
major office, it does help to clarify a lot of things. And I was fortunate enough to be in that place, in that time, and I knew the men who had started the primary opposition organization to Duke, and so I started doing that work. And I think it was really in the wake of that. And of course, Duke lost. This white supremacist did lose these races, but he got 60% of the white vote in the Senate race, 55 out of 100 in the governor's race. And I remember that was a very clarifying moment for me. And I think a lot of people who were involved in that, who sat down and said, what does it mean that 6 out of 10 white people voted for someone who they know is a Nazi?
And he's persistent. He's still around. That's
still
amazing.
around, still around. And I think for those of us who saw that, it was that moment where we said, listen, what is really different about those 60%, 670,000 people, and us? And the only real difference, you could be smug, you could say, well, we're better people because we knew not to vote for this horrible person. But the reality is the only thing that really delineated or differentiated us was that we had had certain experiences growing up that led us down a path. And these 670,000 other people who voted for the Nazi obviously had different experiences. And they weren't to blame for their experiences, and I wasn't due any credit for mine. So I had to sort of humble myself in the face of that white behavior and say, that's the work, is to work with those people and to figure out how we can do better.
I think your story is really clarifying, and I can't prove this, and I don't know any numbers, but I really suspect there are millions of Americans who've never known a black person, never met somebody from abroad, really don't know anybody well, except people like themselves. And just right out of the gate, I think that is not good. That's
I
creates
think
a problem.
And I think we sometimes underestimate the importance of those personal connections. Obviously, they're not sufficient. The fact that I went to a black preschool was not going to make me into an activist and an anti-racism educator. The fact that I grew up in a progressive home, that wasn't going to be enough. But I do think that if you don't have those experiences, if you don't have those connections, the odds of you really developing a deep sensibility around this stuff is pretty slim. You might have a surface level. You might have a level that says, oh, I know I should treat people fairly. But, as far as actually having to do that, it's one thing to say it. It's quite another to actually figure out how to practice it. And I think that's where the personal relationships come in.
Yeah. You so clearly have an unusual job, but it's still a job. You still have to get up and go on your trips and et cetera. Where do you think social justice comes into your work most directly? I mean, do you have a sense that, here it is, now we're doing it?
Well, I mean, obviously, when I'm meeting with people around the country, and I speak on campuses, I speak in communities, when I'm actually having to sit down and strategize, it's one thing to get up and give a talk, and obviously a lot of my work is just giving a lecture and then I'm out the door the next day. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it also is sitting down and talking with people who are in the work, in their communities, and trying to figure out, how do we strategize around issues of racial justice or whatever we're talking about? And I think that's where it really gets deep, is when you start talking about practically what are we going to do in this community or on this campus to deal with whatever's going on. It could be overt racism, it could be institutional inequality, whatever it is that they're working on. To me, that's where the work gets really significant.
Yeah, in the academic world that I come from, people have a lot of knowledge about what's going on, but they very often don't get to the step you're describing. What do we do? What are the action steps?
I think that's true. And I think that's one of the reasons I wasn't really attracted to academe, that and the fact that I just, didn't want to go any further into debt. So it was partly that once I got out of college, I was like, I'm done, I'm not doing grad school. But I wanted to contribute in some way. And so part of what I do and what I think a lot of us who do the work that I do is we try to distill the work of academics, take all this great work that they're doing around race, whether it's on issues of subconscious bias or, systemic racism, racist frames like Joe Fagan talks about it at A&M, and make it accessible to people, right? So you take academic language, which sometimes is not accessible, and you try to break it down for the community. You try to make it accessible to people where they can use it and utilize it in terms of trying to make their world better.
A number of people I know who are a little like you, sort of move in the same direction, have a sense the last 10 years have been kind of a surprise. Maybe they thought that we were on the verge of a move forward in terms of social justice and racial equity, et cetera, and they're a little surprised that it's been something else. They're disappointed in some ways. Would you count yourself in that group? Has this been a tough decade?
I'm never disappointed because I have very little expectation when it comes to America getting race right. And I don't mean to be cynical by saying that. I just have a broad enough sense of history to know that we usually get it wrong. And that doesn't mean we can't do better, but it means that I'm always prepared for the bad things that often happen. I also think it's important to never look at history as merely progress or regress. There are movements forward and movements backward, and they're happening at the same time. So you can have certain steps that are taking us in a direction that I think is salutary and positive. So you can say, for instance, okay, we're becoming a more multiracial, pluralistic nation, whether some like it or not, it's happening. And as a result of that, you're seeing some real connections between people that maybe wouldn't have existed 25, 30 years ago. On the other hand, you have the election of a man as president who, comes to power on the back of racial scapegoating and finger pointing at those people, whoever those people might be, whether they're Muslims, Mexican immigrants, black folks in cities. And those things happen at the same time. So the country moves forward over here and moves backward over here, but it's the same country. And I think if you take a nuanced view of it, you don't necessarily have to get discouraged. You just have to figure out, okay, how do we focus on what's going on good over here, and how do we make this a stronger part of the narrative than this?
Don't you think that a lot of people who did get discouraged over the last 10 years, one, maybe had unrealistic expectations of what Barack Obama could do, and two, just did not anticipate the backlash? You've elected a black president, well, we're going to double down, and racism seemed to just come out of the woodwork, and during that period.
Well, I think anyone who really believed that we were in something of a post-racial era because of the election of a black man clearly doesn't really understand American history. And I think it was wishful thinking, and it was incredibly naive. And I think it's something Barack Obama certainly never thought. He certainly knew better, but I think a lot of people didn't. And I think those of us who do the work knew. I mean, those of us who were in it every day knew this is a signal event, but it means something. Obviously, it's meaningful. But the question as to what it means, we never really got around to asking. It doesn't mean, even if people voted for Barack Obama, the idea that means that they don't harbor any racism would be like a man who's married to a woman saying that because he's heterosexual, he can't be a sexist. It's absurd, right? Obviously, men can be sexist even if they date, sleep with, and marry women, and that's a lot more intimate than who you vote for. But the idea that somehow, well, I voted for Barack Obama, it became sort of the, I have a black friend this was my black friend of the 21st century kind of argument, and it doesn't mean anything, obviously, systemically.
Well, you're making a point that some really young people, activists have been on this show recently, have said that your generation, really looking at me, and I'm older than you are, you make too much of voting, as if that's the way to be involved. There's so many other ways to have impact, and don't overvalue that. And I think,
well, voting's a tactic. It's a tactic just like anything, and I don't want to undersell it or oversell it. It's important. Who is in power does matter, and anyone who says that it doesn't is, I think, almost cynical to a point of uselessness, right? If you actually say, well, if voting, I've seen the bumper stickers, I'm sure you have, if voting changed anything, it would be illegal. Well, that's very pithy. It looks very cute on the back of your car. But the reality is, if voting didn't matter at all, they wouldn't be trying so hard to keep people from doing it, right? There are a lot of people in this country that are working overtime to make sure they don't vote. So obviously, somebody knows that it matters. The question is, how much weight do we put on it? It's just one tactic, and it can be an important one, but it's not any more important than 10 or 15 other tactics.
I hadn't seen the bumper sticker, so I'm still thinking of the ways it's true, actually. But I take your point.
True,
but I take your point.
Right. And the fact is, they are trying to make it illegal for some people. So that clearly says that it is important.
Yeah, and it's always shocked me that the country as a whole isn't really offended by attempts to block voting. I mean, that just seems so against what the country is about.
Well, no, I mean, the question is very simple. If you believe that more people should vote, then you believe in democracy. And if you believe that fewer people should vote, then you're a reactionary who believes that the better people should rule. And that's really the primary distinction between right and left in this country. It's not about, the right would have you believe, I think, have us all believe, that it's about, we want smaller government. It's not about smaller government. The right doesn't mind big government when it's about the national security state. They don't mind big government when it's about snooping in your bedroom, figuring out what you're doing sexually. They have no problem with controlling women's reproductive assets. What they do have a problem with is government on behalf of the less powerful. So when you want the better people to rule, it's very much like the royalists at the time of the French Revolution when the notions of right and left were created. Those on the right wanted the old monarchy. Those on the left wanted democracy. And that's the real distinction.
So you're saying there are these surrogate issues like less government and voter verification, et cetera, and they're just proxy issues that hide other deeper things. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
If somebody came here from another planet, kind of did a little survey, they'd say, well, race is clearly a national problem. Why aren't they talking about it productively? And I mean, it's a good question. There's not a lot of productive discussion of race at the national level. Why aren't we at least talking about it? Talk is cheap. Let's at least talk. But you don't.
Yeah, but I think the fear that a lot of people have is talk can lead to action. And if you are afraid of what that action might look like. So if we have a real honest conversation about race, for instance, that might actually mean that we're going to have to do something at the end of that discussion or maybe during that discussion to rectify some of the inequalities. And so there are people who have a real interest in not rectifying them. And that may not be a conscious interest. It may not be that, I don't think, for instance, that white Americans go to bed at night going, oh my God, I really hope we don't have to make it right in this country. I don't think most people think about it at all. But the problem is if you put it in someone's face and you say, we're going to have this conversation, and it might lead to policies that redistribute some of this power, whether it's financial power or decision-making power. I think for people who have been winning for a really long time, even if they're good people, even if they're really good, decent people, it's like you don't want to give up your edge. And I think that becomes a really big sticking point.
Well, that's kind of what I was thinking, too, because I can remember moments in the Obama presidency where you could see he was just walking on eggshells, not because he was thinking of racists, but thinking of the tender sensibilities of the white people who just don't know about white privilege. And just have no sense of what they're a part of. And he just didn't want to kind of shake them too much.
Right.
And,
Well, I mean, you can't know what you haven't been taught. And I think the vast majority of white Americans haven't really, been taught much about the history of this country. And what we have been taught has been, George Washington and cherry trees and can't tell a lie and absurdities like that, none of which are true. We haven't really had to deal with the truth. And I think people of color, by and large, not all, but most people of color have a keen sense of that history, whether they got it in school or got it at home. So it's like, white America and America of color is like having a book club where, half the country, or 62%, which is white, have read the preface. And the other 38% have read the whole 400, 500 pages, and then we're supposed to get together and have a conversation. Well, how do you have a conversation with someone that read the whole book when you've only done like 8 pages? You're like, oh, this is a really interesting book. And they're like, really? How far did you get? Well, 9 pages in. Oh, well, read some more, And I think it's really hard to have a conversation with that kind of imbalance.
I'm kind of smiling because what you're actually asking for, saying that might be valuable, is so simple. Know the history of the country, go past the platitudes and maybe get a little more interested in the founders. They didn't know race very well. They weren't into gender, but this sort of multicultural democracy was a very interesting notion that they had.
You have to know the country's history. You also have to know your own. I think that the problem is too, we have these false narratives that we tell about ourselves, right? We have this narrative, and it's part of the country's mythology. This notion of rugged individualism, this notion of meritocracy, this idea that whatever we have, we got on our own.
Exceptionalism.
This notion of American exceptionalism and personal exceptionalism. So if you had to figure out what's the secular gospel of America, what's Genesis 1:1, it is the notion of rugged individualism. And so the problem with that is if I believe, even if I'm very progressive, if I still tend to believe that you sort of get out what you put in, and if you work hard, you can make it, and then I look around and I see the inequalities. I see certain people down here and certain people up here, and the ones down here tend to look a certain way, and the ones up here disproportionately look a different way. Then it becomes really easy for me to internalize the idea that, well, there must be something wrong with these people, and there must be something better about these people. So racism, sexism, classism become normative sort of default positions when you're not interrogating the fundamental ideology of America, which is really hard to do. It's like standing up in the second row of a church on Sunday right after the sermon and announcing that this is all crap, God doesn't exist, right? Like ultimately, that's a really hard decision to get up and do that in church, just like it's a really hard decision in America to say, yeah, this thing that we say really isn't accurate, and we need to interrogate it a little bit more.
You do such a good job of describing the national narratives and the ways in which they come up short. And that situation, that scenario you're describing just seems to be absolutely perfect, ripe for leadership, for people to come onto the scene who can say, we can break these barriers, follow me, this could be good. There's a good energy in a different direction. Why don't we have that leadership? Why don't we have bold, courageous folks who are willing to break some of the barriers you're talking about and help the rest of us see that we could go that way?
Well, I think the problem is those who are leaders, whether we're talking about political leaders, business leaders, civic leaders, they've been educated or miseducated in the same system that the rest of us have been. So frankly, a lot of our quote unquote leaders don't know any more about this stuff than the average person on the street. They might have a little bit more technical knowledge, but for the most part, they're in the dark as well. And I think we don't have a lot of folks who really at that level understand or really know what to do about systemic inequality any more than the average person I could go up to in a cafe or something and ask,
Okay, we're going to change that right now. We're going to make you king of the world, and you're going to be able to make...
Bad call.
Let's go with it. We're going to make you king of the world. You're going to be able to make 2 or 3 really deep changes in the culture that's all you can do, but these are going to be ones that you can make that would have the best chance of moving things forward. What 2 or 3 changes would you most like to see?
Well, the first thing I would do, I would change it where there's no longer a king of the world, because, and I mean that not to be pithy. I mean, like, seriously, I think the problem is we vest too much power in our own country already in a handful of hands, right?
Yeah.
We have 0.1% of the population owns as much wealth as the bottom 90%. 38 people own the same wealth as the bottom half of the country. So clearly, we got too much concentration of power, and I don't want to be the one ruled or the one ruling. Even though it'd be nicer, I guess, to be the boss, it's good to be the king, as Mel Brooks said many years ago. But I think I wouldn't want anyone to have that power. That'd be the first change, is we need more diffuse power. And we need to have, and that's what I was saying a second ago about empowering communities to make certain decisions. So the first decision is no king, no ruler. The second thing is figuring out how to devolve authority, not the way that conservatives often do it. But conservatives will talk about, well, we want to take the power from the federal government, give it to state government. But I actually want to go further than that, because they want to do that because they run the state governments. That's why they want to do that. I want to see communities empowered to make their own decisions about who's going to police their streets, about who's going to teach their kids, particularly when they're marginalized populations. I would love to see, for instance, a situation where if you wanted to be a cop in a low-income, working-class, person of color community, you had to be vetted by the community. You spent the first 90 days basically meeting people in the community, going door to door, knocking on doors, sitting in coffee shops, sitting in barbershops, going to their churches, meeting them, getting to know them. And at the end of 90 days, they vote on you. Like it's not, you don't get chosen because you can shoot a gun and run real fast and you pass a test. You get chosen because you demonstrate to the community that you are about justice and about trying to really protect them rather than control them.
Or somebody who does terrible things when there's not an iPhone there to capture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think and to me, that's better for the community and the cop, because if I'm that cop, I know that I'm going to be safer if I've gotten to know everybody in the neighborhood already. They're not going to look at me and assume that I'm there to hurt them. I'm not going to look at them and assume that they're there to hurt me. So it's a better situation all around. Same thing for teaching. I don't think it makes any sense for teachers to be able to come into a community they know nothing about, maybe do 5 weeks of training with Teach for America, and then get turned loose on a community that they're completely they're not from there. They don't know the people there. I think the community needs to be able to make that decision. So that'd be the second thing. And then the third thing is I would ask for more wishes and more time, because it's like when you get Aladdin's lamp, you want more wishes. Because I haven't thought it through enough to be able to maybe give you a bunch of other ones. But I think number one is, diffuse power. Number two is devolving authority to local communities. And I think if that happens, you would begin to see a lot of really good stuff bubbling up from the grassroots and from the base, rather than having to come from, political elites.
It's interesting that some of the issues you're raising, because people are so focused on Hamilton and Broadway right now. But the Madison-Hamilton debate was back in the 18th century, was exactly on some of these issues about where the power is going to be and it will be centralized. A lot of folks listening to this, watching this show, or listening to the show on radio will kind of envy your reach, the kinds of things that you're able to have an impact on, and they would like to have. They would like to do meaningful things in their lives that could move things forward in a helpful way. What are some steps that people who aren't Tim Wise, but are in sort of jobs, what can they do?
I think there's no limit to that. I mean, the reality is not everybody's going to be an activist. Not everybody's going to be a writer. Not everybody's going to be a speaker. A lot of people don't even want to be those things. But think about all the different roles that one can play. I mean, if you work in an average everyday job, just go to work, and you could be the boss or you could not be the boss. You have the ability in that space to make it more equitable, to make sure that issues, whether it's hiring and promotion, whether it's the evaluation of job applicants, whether it's the way that you interrelate with your coworkers, is more equitable. You have the ability, if you own a business, for instance, or if you're in the HR department, or if you work at a college in the admissions department, to really apply notions of racial equity, gender equity, class equity to your decision-making process. Part of that is about what we know in the last 10 years from the research from brain science is evaluating your own subconscious biases, getting in touch with the fact that we all have them, and if we're aware of them, and if we're checking them on a regular basis, we actually can do a pretty good job of keeping them from influencing our decisions and the way we actually behave. The problem is we don't talk about that enough. So I want to see businesses, I want to see schools, I want to see nonprofit organizations having these conversations with their employees, encouraging us to really dig deep into our own biases so that we can check against them. Because I think most people are good folks. I think most people want to do right by others. I don't think most people wake up in the morning and think about oppressing people.
I want to oppress somebody.
Right, they don't do that. But the reality is we fall into patterns of behavior that are programmed for a very long time. And I think that if you're in whatever job you're in, you have the capacity to say, hey, let's have a conversation about that. If you're a parent, you have the ability to raise your children in a way, expose them to difference and different ways of thinking and knowing that maybe they won't get in the school. That's all my mom did, and I put all in quote marks. My mom was not an activist. She was not a radical, but she made certain decisions that had an influence on who I became. That's the work, just as much as what I'm doing.
That is a great place to stop. Thank you. Very, very, very helpful. Tim, thank you for being on the show today.
You bet. Thank you.
That's all we have time for today. Please find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you so much for being a part of today's show. Join us next time for more Current Conversations.